Eve Thomas smiled to herself. At last, she had done it. After so many false starts, she was about to walk through the arrival's gate to where her soon-to-be lover would be waiting for her. It had been a long road to get here. She had met Peter, her would-be lover, when he started to frequent the same cafe for lunch about 3 months ago. Shelley, one of her friends, noticed him first and pointed out to Eve that she had an admirer. Eve turned to look and saw a very handsome man sitting a few tables away. He smiled at Eve, and she, taken by surprise, blushed and smiled with embarrassment before turning back to her friends. Over the next few weeks, he was there every lunchtime, always smiling. She felt flattered that this handsome stranger was so obviously attracted to her. Then one day, as she sat at her usual table, she noticed a vase of flowers on it. When she asked the waitress about them, she was handed a note. "My beautiful Eve, I have had to go away for a little while. I hope these flowers will remind you of me. All my love, Peter." Eve was not sure what to make of it. She had never encouraged or even spoken to Peter, but she was flattered and had returned his smiles whenever their eyes met. Eve had been happily married for the last 10 years. She had 2 lovely children, Sam, who was 5, and Toby, who was 7. She adored her loving husband, David, and had no intention of spoiling her marriage by having a liaison with anyone. However, she enjoyed being flattered by this man's attentions. Quite a few of her friends in the office had had affairs and one-night flings, but none of their boyfriends that she had seen had been anything like as handsome as Peter. Eve was gathering a lot of kudos from her colleagues for his attention. Every day for the next week, as Eve's little group sat down to lunch, the waitress would bring another vase of flowers to the table, along with a note. There would only be a few lines, saying things like, "I am missing seeing your beautiful eyes every day," or "Lunchtimes are not the same without you." Eve would smile at her friends and put the notes in her bag without letting them know the contents. All her colleagues were convinced that she was having an affair with Peter, but Eve kept her own counsel. She was enjoying her notoriety. Then, one Monday morning, a large bouquet of flowers arrived at Eve's desk with a note that simply said, "Romanos, 12:30 p.m. Love, Peter." All the girls were saying that Romanos was the classiest and most expensive restaurant in the area. None of them had ever been there. They remarked on how lucky Eve was that Peter was taking her to lunch there and not to the cafe with them. Eve was of 2 minds about what to do now. She had never intended to get involved with Peter, but he had only invited her to lunch, and Eve could see no harm in that. It was an innocent lunch after all. So she decided she would go. Eve had never been to such an impressive restaurant in her life. The maitre d' escorted her to their table, where Peter was already waiting. Peter stood up, kissed the back of her hand, and said, "Thank you for joining me, Eve. I know you only have an hour for lunch, so I have taken the liberty of ordering for you to save time." Eve told him that the girls had said they would cover for her if she were back late. Eve found Peter to be a very charming person. They talked all through lunch, and Peter informed her that he had been in the States all last week, enthralling her with stories of the places he visited for work. She didn't notice that he never actually said where he worked or for whom. All too soon, the lunch was over, and Peter said it was time for her to go back to her office before she got into trouble. He asked if she would please have lunch with him again the next day. Eve said she wasn't too sure, but Peter mentioned another good restaurant she had never been to and said that there were no strings attached. He just didn't like eating alone and enjoyed having a beautiful lady to talk to. Eve was flattered yet again and thought to herself that Peter had not made a pass at her. If he continued to act the gentleman, what could be the harm in enjoying her lunch hours with him? So, from there, it developed. For the next few weeks, Peter would take her to lunch 2 or 3 times a week at the most expensive restaurants in town. Peter never made a direct pass at her, but Eve, without realizing it, was slowly falling under his spell. Then one day, Peter asked her if she would like to go to a concert, as he had been given some tickets but had no one to go with. Eve thought she would enjoy the concert, so she agreed to go. Eve's journey down the road to cheating on her husband truly began when she told her first lie. She claimed she was going to a concert with a friend from work. Her husband raised no objection, saying that classical music wasn't his thing. He even offered to drive them there. But Eve said they were going straight from work after having a meal at a cafe. Her friend's husband would drop her off at home afterward, saving them the cost of a babysitter if her husband stayed with the children. Eve and Peter went for a meal before the concert. Eve drank perhaps a little too much wine and had more to drink during the intermission. By the time they left the theater, she was quite relaxed. The next thing she knew, they were sitting in Peter's car, kissing passionately. Peter's hand found its way inside her dress, and Eve was getting carried away. Just as she started to think she wanted Peter to take her cell phone rang. Eve pulled it out of her purse and saw that it was her home number. She heard her mother's voice on the other end. "We didn't call you earlier because David told me to let you enjoy the concert," her mother said. "But I waited until I was sure it was finished. Your father and I are at your house looking after the baby. Toby fell off his bike, and David has taken him to the hospital. We thought you would want to know. David just called to say Toby is fine, and they'll be home shortly." Eve panicked as she told Peter what had happened. He dropped her off at a discreet distance from her house to ensure no one would see her getting out of his car. David arrived home shortly afterward and carried a sleeping Toby up to his bedroom. When he came down again, he told them that Toby only had a few abrasions, nothing serious. But things had taken a long time because some people in the ER had been involved in a fight. Apparently, a man had caught his wife messing around with another guy, and the two men got into a brawl. The wife had tried to separate them, and ended up on the receiving end of one of their punches. The police were in the ER to make sure the two men didn't start up again. David found it all quite entertaining and asked, "Why would a good woman want to mess up a good marriage?" Unfortunately, Eve didn't see the humor in the story. As her mother and father were preparing to leave, her mother asked, "How was the concert, Eve? And who did you go with?" "Oh, I really enjoyed it," Eve replied. "It's such a shame Dave's not into classical music. I went with Marie, one of the receptionists from work. Her husband doesn't like classical music either. She's been asking around the office for someone to go with her for weeks. There's another concert next week, so we might go again if Dave doesn't mind." David didn't reply to the comment, only suddenly announcing that it had been a long day and he was going to bed. When he finally got to bed, David was apparently fast asleep. Eve was feeling very aroused, but no matter how much she tried, she couldn't get David interested. Poor Eve. She had enjoyed her evening and found both the music and her company very arousing. It was a shame she had been so busy canoodling that she failed to notice the white estate car parked by the curb when they came out of the concert hall. She didn't see the small child asleep in the back seat, or the driver of the car watching her and Peter cuddle and kiss as they walked back to Peter's car. Peter and Eve had been so engrossed in each other that they didn't notice the car following them slowly down the street and stopping behind them when they got into Peter's car and started making out. They weren't aware of the driver making a call on his cell phone that would shortly lead to Eve's phone ringing. To Eve, everything seemed perfect. She had a nice weekend and saw her husband off to golf on Saturday morning. She was a little surprised that he didn't kiss her goodbye. In fact, she hadn't noticed that he hadn't kissed her since Wednesday. He had gone to work early on Thursday and Friday before she was awake. On Monday morning, Eve's car wouldn't start, so David drove her to work. It was Monday lunchtime when she met Peter. As he kissed her, she realized that besides kissing her children, it was her first kiss since she said goodnight to Peter after the concert. She mentioned this to Peter, but he laughed it off, saying, "Good, I don't want you kissing your husband. You should save all your kisses for me." When David picked her up from work that evening, he told Eve that her car would be off the road for some time because major work needed to be done on the engine. David would have to drive her to work and pick her up every day for a while. On Wednesday evening, Eve told David she was going to another concert, but Eve had no intention of going to the concert. She and Peter planned to go out for a meal, some dancing, and then, well, whatever came up until lunchtime. As Eve walked into the cafe to meet Peter, the first person she saw was her father. She thought how lucky she was to have noticed him right away and went over to sit with him. "Hi, Dad. What are you doing here?" David said, "You normally eat in here, and he said you were going to the concert tonight. I am taking your mother along as she got so enthusiastic when you were talking about it last week. I thought we could meet you for a meal before we go, and then your mother and I will drop you home." Eve's heart nearly stopped. This meant she would have to go to the concert, and she could not go there with Peter. Her parents had very old-fashioned views, and if they saw her with any man other than David, all hell would break loose. They would not stand for her breaking her marriage vows. Eve asked her father to excuse her for a moment and walked to the ladies' restroom, signaling her friend Shelley to follow. Once inside, she convinced Shelley to go to the concert with her and asked her to explain to Peter why he couldn't speak to him. Therefore, it was to the concert with Shelley that she went that night. At the concert, Shelley told Eve that Peter had mentioned he was going away on business again tomorrow, so he had given Shelley an email address where Eve could get in touch with him. On Thursday evening, Eve had to ask David how to send emails. Although she sometimes used a computer at work, they held no interest for her, so she was almost computer illiterate. When David asked whom she wanted to email, she showed him the addresses of some of the girls at work and said that they were always talking about emailing one another, so she thought she would join in their little game. Unfortunately, Eve did not realize that cheating wives who know little about computers should never ask their husbands to set up an email account for them. For the next couple of weeks, increasingly risque and suggestive emails passed back and forth between Eve and Peter. By the end of the second week, they were openly discussing what they were going to do in bed together, and even joking about BDSM sessions. It hadn't occurred to Eve that what used to be a regular sex life with her husband had come to a complete standstill. If she had stopped thinking of Peter for just one moment, she might have noticed that her once loving husband hardly spoke to her and never kissed her anymore. But Eve was too wrapped up in her thoughts of Peter. When Peter asked her to come to Paris for a romantic weekend, she jumped at the chance. She broached the subject with David, telling him that some of the girls in the office had booked the weekend, but one of them had to drop out because her father was in the hospital. David said that if she wanted to go to Paris, who was he to stop her? She was a big girl and could make up her own mind about what she did. She thanked him and went to give him a kiss, but he turned away before she could do so and went out into the garden. Eve got on the computer and emailed Peter that she was coming. She asked him all kinds of questions. Where were they going to stay? Where would they go? Besides bed, that is. Peter sent her a detailed itinerary of what they were going to do both in and out of the bedroom. On Friday afternoon, David and the children had driven her to the station to catch the train to Gatwick Airport. David inquired where the other girls were. Eve told him they all lived in Brighton, so she would meet them at the airport. As her train began to move away, David called out something that she didn't catch the end of. She thought he said, "It's not too late," but she lost the rest of it. Eve tried to call David on her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He must have had it turned off. Then she was walking through the arrivals gate, and standing there was Peter. Eve threw her arms around him and said, "At last, we are together." They kissed and walked outside to catch a taxi. On the way to the hotel, Peter again outlined their agenda. First, a couple of hours in a luxury suite, then a cafe, followed by the valet. Eve's head was spinning. When they got to the hotel, Peter went to the desk to check in. Eve was standing nearby, looking around at the plush interior, when suddenly she was aware that a man standing beside her was talking to her. "Madam, I am Thomas," he repeated. "Yes, I have a package for you. Will you sign here, please?" Eve took the offered pen and began to sign, noticing that clipped to his board was a photograph of her. The man must have used it to identify her. Eve began to get an uneasy feeling in her stomach as the courier gave her a large brown envelope that had her name on it. Eve looked at the envelope for a few seconds and then tore it open. Inside, she found a large photograph of David and the children. They were holding a sign that read "Goodbye," and on the back of the photograph, Toby had scrawled, "Why, Mommy?" The enormity of her situation suddenly hit Eve, and she began to cry. David knew that she had not come to Paris with the girls, and he must know about Peter. Peter, having finished checking in, turned to her and, seeing her crying, asked her what was wrong. "My husband knows about you and what we were going to do here." "So what if he knows?" "He's in London and we're here in Paris. What's he going to do about it?" "Divorce me. That's what he's going to do." "Look, Eve, he was bound to find out sometime. Husbands always do. He has just found out a little earlier than we expected, and we mustn't let that spoil our weekend. Let's get up to our room and enjoy ourselves for a little while. We've only got an hour or so before dinner." It finally dawned on Eve that Peter's only interest in her was getting her into bed. The fact that her marriage to the man she loved was most likely over did not worry Peter in the slightest. He just wanted to have sex with her and do all those other things he had written about in the emails. She finally realized Peter had set out to seduce her and cared nothing for the consequences. Peter once again asked her to come up to their room. When she refused, he quietly and surreptitiously grabbed hold of her arm, twisting it behind her back, and kissed her deeply on the lips to quiet her. He then whispered in her ear, "Listen, you little witch, I have spent months and a large amount of money getting you here. Now my friends and I are going to get our money's worth. You are going to come with me now. The more you resist, the more you will regret it later." Holding her arm tightly, he marched her into a lift. People were looking at them because he was making quite a lot of noise. However, Peter calmly smiled and called out something in French, which made everyone laugh. The porter carrying their bags was already in the lift, and she saw him press the button for the 6th floor. Eve realized she was in real trouble now. How could she have been so stupid? She knew nothing about this man. He was dragging her up to a room where he intended to assault her. No, not just him. He had mentioned his friends, which must mean she was going to be assaulted by other men besides Peter. As the lift doors began to close, 4 large men stepped inside. "Oh my God," thought Eve. "Are these his friends? 5 of them. Please, someone help me." As the lift began to ascend, things happened so bewilderingly quickly that Eve could not recall the chain of events. She was suddenly aware that Peter was no longer holding her arm. He was lying on the floor, apparently unconscious. One of the big men was now holding her, but much more gently than Peter had. She heard one of the men telling the porter, who was carrying the suitcases, to keep quiet and to come with them. The lift stopped, and she felt herself bundled out of one lift and into another. The doors closed, and the lift started moving down instead of up. Eve was terrified because these obviously weren't Peter's friends. What was going to happen to her now? She began to cry out, but stopped when she heard one of the men say, "Shut up, you stupid woman. Why the hell he bothered to send us after you, I'll never know. If you were my wife, I'd have left you to be the hooker that prick intended to make you. Now shut up. We don't need any trouble with the French police." The lift stopped in the basement car park. Eve was pulled out of the lift and shoved into the back of a car that was waiting. One of the men said something to the driver, and the car pulled away. Eve looked at her saviors through the rear window and realized that she recognized 2 of them. She recalled that she had seen them talking with David at his firm's Christmas party. She thanked her lucky stars that she had such a wonderful husband, and then started crying again. When they got to the airport, the driver produced her bag from the boot and gave her a ticket to London. Then she was alone. Eve got on the next available flight back to England. Eve arrived back home by taxi to find the house in darkness, her car parked in the drive, and an estate agent's "for sale" sign in the front garden. She walked up to the door, but her key would not fit in the lock. Then she noticed an envelope under her car's windscreen wiper. It contained a note. Eve got into her car before she read it. Eve, you won't get into the house. The locks have been changed. Your clothes are at your mother's. The children and I have gone away on holiday. When the house is sold, you will get your fair share. If you wish, you can give your share of it to your pimp Peterson. That's what hookers normally do. The note wasn't signed, but Eve knew who it was from. Eve sat in her car and cried for a while, then drove over to her mother's house. Her father opened the door and called over his shoulder, "Mother, our little piglet has come home. Should I let her in?" "You had better bring the stupid little cow in here. I think she needs to know just how stupid and lucky she has been." As Eve sat down, her mother told her father, "You'd better give Eve some of that brandy." Then she started, "David has told us everything. You were stupid enough to take a good and patient man for a fool. Someone in your office told him that this man, Peterson, was after your knickers before you had even spoken to him. Dave tried to warn you by talking about people he knew who were getting divorced because the wife was seduced." Eve thought back and remembered that conversation. She had agreed with David that all a man could do was divorce his wife after she committed adultery. Why had she not realized that David was warning her? "Dave was aware of all your lunch dates. You will see from the contents of that folder on the table that Dave knew about every meeting you had with Peterson. Why didn't he stop me then? If he had stopped me, none of this would have happened." "Eve," her father came in at that point, "if Dave had stopped you, what would you have done? Been more careful so that Dave couldn't catch you with your next boyfriend. Dave didn't want that kind of heartache. He was convinced you would see the error of your ways and come back to him before it was too late. Dave watched you and Peterson come out of that first concert. He called your father and got me to call you on the pretense that he was short of credit on his phone. He knew that you would come home straight away when you heard Toady had been hurt that same evening. Dave sat there and talked about the fight over the adulterous wife at the hospital, and you still didn't catch on. But your father did, and that's why he took me to the concert the next Wednesday. Dad, if you knew, why didn't you stop me?" I wasn't sure what was going on. However, I knew David was upset about something. If you'd noticed the look he gave you when you said you were going to another concert, you would have turned to stone. When I saw you come into the cafe at lunchtime, I knew what you were up to. And I saw how you looked at that man, Peterson, so I knew who he was. Why do you keep calling him Peterson? His name is Peter Watts. I think you'd better take a good look through that folder, girl. Dave left it for you. He thought you might like to know just whom you were sharing your bed with." Eve picked up the folder, opened it, and pulled out a sheaf of 4 papers. The top sheet was a photocopy of a police mug shot labeled Peter Watts. Below the picture, someone had written, "History, drug smuggling, pimp, mule runner, possibly involved in 2 suspicious deaths in Sweden and 1 in Germany. Wanted for questioning about the disappearances of several women associated with him by the Met. Interpol can find no trace of them. It's believed he could be involved in a high-priced prostitution ring running out of Paris. A woman acting as a mule died in the U.S., and the FBI has linked Watts with her. There are outstanding arrest warrants issued by the FBI, as well as Germany, Holland, and France. Last known location, London, 10 days ago. He skipped shortly before the police could arrest him. Now believed to be in France or Spain. The Dutch authorities have issued a European warrant for drug smuggling, so he can be arrested on site. Dave, as you have asked for a copy of this report, I can only assume you have come across our Mr. Lars Watts somewhere. Any help in locating him would be appreciated. Feel free to call if you need any assistance." Eve had a quick look at the rest of the papers. Some were lists of all the lunch dates she had with Peter, giving times, places, what they had eaten, and even the cost of the bill. The rest were printouts of all her emails to Peter and his replies. Assuming her parents had read them, she felt sick. Eve looked up from the papers at her father, her face showing confusion. "How did you come by all this?" she asked. "We didn't. Dave had it. He only got the police report last week. If he had received it earlier, he would have stopped Watts straight away. He thinks it was his inquiries that informed the police Watts was back in England. He gave the file to us last night when we dropped him and the children at the airport to catch their plane. He said he didn't know if or when you would show up, but when you did, we were to give it to you. Where is he taking my children? Do you know? Of course, your father and I know, but Dave would only tell us where they were going after we had promised not to tell you. And after the way you've behaved, we are going to keep that promise. We want to be involved in our grandchildren's lives, even if you don't. Dave could well have gone off and told us nothing. However, after he had taken you to the station, he was considerate enough to come here and see us. He told us all about what you had been up to and what you had intended to do in Paris. Dave even told us that he had the police and some of his friends following you. The police were only interested in Watts. Dave's friends were there to get you out if it looked like you were in any danger. His friend called us last night and told us they had been forced to get violent with that Watts man. The British police had informed the French authorities of his location, but could not do anything until the French police got there. When they thought you were no longer with him of your own free will, they decided to act. Dave's people, with the help of the British officers, got you out. You might like to know that your lover boy is now in a Paris jail. Eve began crying again. She curled up into a ball on the sofa and cried herself to sleep. Her parents, relieved that she had not been injured, said nothing more to her that night and went to bed, her father sending a quick text message on his cell phone before he went to sleep. It was late Saturday morning when Eve woke to the sounds and smells of breakfast being prepared. She went into the kitchen, where her father looked up from his newspaper and told her that Dave had booked and paid for a room with full board for a month at the Crown Hotel for her to use. Dave said that she would be able to walk to work from there and could use the month to find a flat. Eve was taken aback. I thought that you and Mom would let me stay here. Well, to tell you the truth, your brother and sister have already said that they do not wish to see you anymore, and if you were to move in here, they would not bring the grandchildren to visit us. Well, that's bloody marvelous, Eve retorted. My husband abandons me and takes my children away, and my own siblings disown me. What the hell are you talking about? Dave didn't leave you. You left him. And going by what that police report said, if it had not been for the men Dave sent to look after you, you might not have been able to come back. You have broken the heart of a wonderful man. He did everything he could to get you to realize what you were doing. He could have told me. He knew what you were doing, and what would he have achieved by that? You might have stopped your affair, but he would never have been able to trust you. He would have to watch you all the time, waiting for the next man to catch your fancy. That's no way to run a marriage. Her father turned back to his paper. As far as he was concerned, the conversation was over. But what am I going to do? I love my husband and my children. I want them back. I want my life back. Oh God, what am I going to do? Eve's mother turned from the sink where she was washing the breakfast dishes. You've made your bed. Now you must lie in it. You must realize that Dave is still deeply in love with you. That is why he has done so much to look after you. You need to start eating humble pie. And if I were you, I would start writing him an apology as quickly as you can and beg him to take you back. You will have to convince Dave how much you love him, and that you will not do anything like this again. But don't expect him to be easily convinced. You are the only one who can put your marriage back together. I would be careful what you do and who you speak to. From looking at that file, I should imagine he has had someone watching you for some time, probably since he first heard about this man Peterson. Dave might still have them watching you in case any of Peterson's friends show up. That could well be the reason he's booked you into the Crown. Any of the other guests could be working for Dave. Eve spent most of the rest of Saturday writing the first of many letters to Dave. Her father suggested she include a note for the children as she had let them down as well. He took the letters and said he would send them on. All contact with Dave and the children would be via her parents for the time being. Then Eve went to her room in the Crown Hotel. Monday morning, she went to work as usual. Her heart wasn't in it, but it kept her mind busy. The girls all asked her how her weekend in Paris had gone. She said as little as possible, just that it was a disaster and she didn't want to talk about it. The only one she wanted to discuss it with was her best friend Shelley, but Shelley never turned up to work all week, and Eve could get no answer from her home or cell phone. Every evening, Eve spent in her room writing letters to Dave and the children. After work, she would drop them off at her parents' house and ask if there was any reply. Eve made sure she always ate her meals in the Crown's dining room. If she was being watched, as her mother had suggested, she wanted to make it obvious that she was alone. The following Monday, word came around the office that Shelley would not be coming back to work. One of the girls came up to Eve and said, "Rumor has it that Shelley has been arrested in Holland for drug smuggling. Since you were her best friend at work, do you think it's true?" Eve didn't know, but she started thinking that it was Shelley who had been the first to point Peter out to her. Shelley had kept insisting that Peter fancied Eve. It was Shelley's assurance that there could be no harm in enjoying a nice lunch with a handsome man that had persuaded Eve to go on the lunch dates with Peter. It was Shelley who had convinced her that she could get away with spending the weekend with Peter in Paris. Could Shelley have been a friend of Peter's? Had Shelley set her up? She figured she would never know. A few days later, the police paid a visit to Eve's office and spoke to some of the girls in private. One of the officers looked vaguely familiar to Eve, but she could not place him until he looked right at her and gave her a wink. She remembered his face from when he had come into the lift in Paris. The girls said later that the police were asking about Shelley. They all expressed surprise that Eve had not been interviewed, as she was Shelley's friend. For the next few weeks, nothing changed. Eve continued writing her letters but received no replies. Her mother did let on that Dave and the children had been in Australia visiting Dave's sister, but had now moved on. The children were missing Eve, but were enjoying their holiday. Apparently, Dave had turned down a good offer for the house. Eve's mother thought this was good news, as it might mean he was considering coming back. As the end of her month at the Crown Hotel drew near, Eve talked with the manager and negotiated a deal to stay on, albeit in a smaller room. She hoped this would send a message to Dave that she was not making any permanent arrangements because she wanted them to get back together. As she struggled with her belongings along the corridor to her new room, Eve heard a man behind her offer to help. Without looking, she said, "I can manage, thank you." "That isn't what you said in Paris." Eve turned and saw the big police officer standing there, smiling. She accepted his offer, and between them, they carried all of her gear to her new room. He introduced himself as Roger, and then proceeded to ask her many questions about Peterson and Shelley, taking a special interest in Shelley's friends at the office and asking if he had ever met any of Shelley's friends other than those at the office. She could be of little help because Eve had only worked at the office a few months. Roger thanked her for her help, but finished by saying, "Eve, you had a lucky escape, which is more than Shelley had." Roger then produced some official-looking forms from his pocket and asked Eve to sign them. As she did so, Eve asked, "What am I signing here?" "The Official Secrets Act. It's a waiver for any injury you might receive while helping us track down and arrest one Lars Peterson. You will note that they are dated 3 months ago. The official story will be that you were working for us as bait for Peterson and Shelley. We put you in the office hoping they would approach you to smuggle drugs for them. All your actions were part of our plan to catch Peterson. When Peterson skipped the country, you convinced him to meet you in Paris, allowing us to put the French on him. It's a good story and should keep the powers that be off yours and Dave's backs. I'm getting lost here. When you say us, you're talking about the police, aren't you? And why would Dave's actions come into it? He was just trying to get me away from Peter. Well, this is where I'm going to get a little vague. But now you've signed the OSA, I can tell you I'm a kind of policeman, although I don't work for any department you've ever heard of. Our job is to target known criminals and terrorists anywhere in the world, mess up their organizations, and if we can, get them behind bars, no questions asked. As for Dave and what he chooses to tell you about his past, That's up to him. All I can say is that I have known Dave a long time. You will have to speak to Dave if you want to know more. You're lucky to have had Dave as a husband." Roger stood up to leave, and Eve said she wasn't so sure she was lucky, as she had lost the man she loved. Roger smiled at her. "I've known Dave a long time. If you love him as much as he loves you, you'll win him back." Eve started to cry. "How can I persuade him to take me back if he won't even talk to me? I'm not even told where he is. The only contact I have is sending letters via my parents." Roger looked thoughtful for a minute and then said, "I will get castrated for telling you this, so don't tell anyone, not even a bloody priest. There is an old lady staying here, Mrs. Grant. Do you know her?" Eve said she had seen her around. "Well, without making it too obvious, I would suggest you try to befriend her. If you get the chance, tell her your story. Convince her, and I think you'll be surprised at what happens. For God's sake, don't make it too obvious. She has seen me come up here and will guess I've come to see you. Is she Dave's spy? Was it her that was tailing me with Peter? No chance. She doesn't follow people. Emily just lives here now. She's retired but used to work with Dave years ago. I should imagine Dave got you a room here, knowing she would look out for his best interests. I wouldn't mind betting she's in regular contact with him. You need to get her on your side. Now I've said enough. Remember, you didn't hear any of this from me. If she thinks you're trying to get to Dave through her, you'll blow your chances. Oh, one more thing. A little less makeup around the eyes. It won't hurt to let her see how much time you spend crying." When Roger had gone, Eve sat and reflected on some of the things he had said. She realized how gullible she had been with Peterson, but also thought about how little she knew about her husband and his life before they were married. Eve remembered how she had first met Dave. He was working as some kind of consultant for the firm she worked at. He would show up in the office now and again, but she never knew what he actually did. When they started going out together, Dave's work took him away for months at a time. He would come home with presents for her from far-flung exotic places, but when she thought about it, she realized that Dave never did say what he did. Details of his trips abroad were limited to descriptions of the places and historic sites he had seen. Once they had gotten married, Dave's trips suddenly got shorter. He would never be away for more than a week at a time, usually visiting places in Europe. Then, once Eve became pregnant, Dave changed his job. He now worked for a firm in the city, and Eve realized she knew a lot more about the job he was doing now than she did about what he had been doing before they had the children. God, am I that naive and gullible? She thought. Was Dave doing some dangerous job for the government all those years, and I knew nothing about it? Was my husband a kind of James Bond character, and I never knew? But then I must be thick, because that Peterson conned me so easily. Over the next couple of weeks, Eve increased the amount of time she spent in the lounge. Now that she was aware of Mrs. Grant's scrutiny, she could feel the old lady watching her when Eve's back was turned. Because she was in the lounge, Eve became acutely aware of the men who tried to pick her up. She would brush off their advances, making sure Mrs. Grant could hear her rebukes. Then Eve had a brainwave. Just after she had told yet another would-be gigolo that she was not interested, she went over to Mrs. Grant's table and asked if she could sit with her. Sitting on her own seemed to be giving all these would-be Casanovas the wrong impression. Eve told Mrs. Grant that she was a happily married woman and didn't appreciate their unwanted attention. This proved to be a masterstroke. Mrs. Grant welcomed Eve to sit with her, saying she had noticed the problems Eve had been having and was aware it was causing her some distress. After that night, Eve joined Mrs. Grant, Emily, as she insisted Eve called her, for all their meals and every evening in the lounge. Emily spent most of her time knitting and reminded Eve of Miss Marple from the Agatha Christie novels. Apparently, she had a similar character. Eve noticed Emily seemed to know all about everyone in the hotel, and soon became aware of Emily surreptitiously asking about Eve's problems. After a couple of these sessions, Eve broke down in tears and rushed off to bed. The following morning, Emily apologized for upsetting her. However, Eve said she needed someone to talk to, and later that day, Eve told Emily the story. Well, as much as she dared. She did not think it prudent to mention Roger. Eve told Emily how much she missed her husband and the children, how she couldn't understand what had possessed her to get involved with Peter in the first place. She had been perfectly content living with her loving husband and children. Peter's seduction had been so subtle that she hadn't even realized what he was doing. Peter had moved very slowly, so slowly that every step towards cheating on Dave had been so small that Eve hadn't realized she had taken it. If she had really thought about what she was doing for just one moment, it would never have happened. Over the following few weeks, Eve and Emily discussed Eve's problems most evenings. Eve thought Emily was quietly giving her the third degree. Emily took her through things time and again, and Eve realized Emily was looking for inconsistencies in what she said. Emily appeared to be looking into Eve's soul. It was during one of these little chats that Eve suddenly noticed Emily's eyes light up. Eve turned to look at what Emily had seen and saw Roger standing at the bar. He brought himself a drink and walked over to them with a big smile on his face. Looking at Emily, he said, "How's things going, Mom? Did you know she always insisted that we all called her Mom in the old days?" The comment was made to Eve, but he kept looking at Emily. "I just got the news that an old friend of ours is arriving at Heathrow in the morning. I was wondering who I could take along to help me look after his kids while our friend sorts a few things out with his wife. Now, who could be better than our Emily? Oh, by the way, you better bring your new friend along as well. I think we're definitely going to need her." Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.